So enactivism meets free energy principle and active inference. There has been like a dialogue between these two quite different theoretical frameworks, and from the free energy principle side, they have stated that they are compatible frameworks. For instance, in this paper by Ramstead from 2020, they call active inference enactive inference, as opposed to like a more representationalist interpretation of inference, of active inference. On the other hand, the enactivists have like already made some critical comments regarding this sort of compatibility. They point out some deep tensions between these two frameworks, namely that of historicity and world involvement, which to them the free energy principle people don't take seriously enough or don't account for. So we're not really going to like look at how these two frameworks have been compared in the past, but we want to ask, what about the role of normativity in these two frameworks? And so in enactivism, we know that normativity is pretty explicitly theorized, specifically ever the so-called normative term in enactivism, but it's much less clear in active inference under free energy principle. So what I'm going to try to do very quickly I will try to first like talk about some shifts in an activist conception of normativity, and using those shifts try to flesh out some dimensions of normativity. And then Moritz will, with this framework of fleshing out, Moritz will talk a bit about active inference, and in the end we will try to see if we can like conceptualize what the normativity in free energy misses, or like can we talk about normativity in the free energy principle, and so on. So, but first, of course, stones. Why are we talking about stones in a conference on vital normativity? And I really like this very poetic story painted by, this is from Sensory Motor Life, from the beginning of the chapter on agency. And so they invite us to imagine like a sheep and a lamb that are like climbing some smooth rock surface. And I think these are actually sheep. I mean, I Googled sheep climbing mountains, so, this is what I got. And we have to imagine that, the heavier sheep misses a step but quickly recovers, and a few small rocks roll downhill and like start tumbling. And so they carefully move like to lower grounds. And then at a certain point, the larger sheep moves her head towards a bit of grass, barely out of reach, at which point she knows she's in trouble. She starts to slip. She looks up, tries quickly to spot a safer place, and ventures to jump upward. But she does not find a good hold to push herself up. And so she begins to slide down the slope. What happens to the sheep now is not unlike what happened to the falling rocks a few seconds ago. Okay, so this is our entry point into stones, into rolling stones from the enactivist side. And they go on to say a bit like, there are some similarities between like these bouncing rocks and the poor sheep that could not control her fall, and also the lighter lamb that is like still carefully descending the rocks. They say the physical forces at play in propelling the movement are the same, and their trajectories are complex but similar. Yet, there is a certain difference between them. So they say that the lamb that has not already slipped controls the descent, even if the same forces drive it in both cases. And as for the tumbling sheep, who is in a way acting very similarly to a rolling stone, we can still say that they say that she's aware of something going wrong and that she tries to do something about it. So there might be like similar physical forces at play in propelling the movement are the same, but the sheep controls the descent and is aware of something going wrong when she slips, and then she tries to do something about it. So this was like a short, they used this example to sort of demarcate tumbling sheep from rolling stones. And this is in the beginning of the chapter on agency. So the enactivist, the modern enactivist take on agency is something in the lines of agents or autonomous systems that are sometimes capable of adaptively regulating their coupling with their environment according to norms established by their own viability conditions. And Baradnia and also in this sensory motor life has like 3 conditions for agency. One is self-individuation, the other is the asymmetrical coupling, so this would be linked to the adaptive coupling, the adaptive regulation of the sensory motor coupling with the environment. And real actions, cognitive actions, are done according to some norms. But as I will show, this has not always been the case. This is only one of the more recent elaborations of agency and normativity in enactivism. So I will try to flesh out some dimensions of normativity through the lens of the normative turn in enactivism. Now, the normative turn, I'm not sure if this is like an established phrase, but it's from Barrett. And he sort of talks about, well, basically how the term normativity has like changed through the years. And this is going to be like a very rough sketch, but we can see first it goes from like this more cognitivist, adaptationist, functionalist conception of value. Then in embodied mind, we get a critique of adaptionism, and we get, and I think adaptionist is like misspelled everywhere, so don't mind that. We get a critique of that, and we get a sort of like a different evolutionary framework, and a sort of prescriptive normativity, but in a very, very light sense. Then the real like normative turn is the shift in the paper Life After Kant by Weber and Varela, where they posit a very Ionesian version of normativity, and we can like term this a sort of like prescriptive normativity. And then there's like the modern development of adaptivity, which goes back to a sort of prescriptive normativity. And of course, there have been some developments like further along. I'm not going to touch about them. I think the next talk will be much better at this. So I will just quickly go now through this, and we will like try to flesh out some distinctions on some dimensions of normativity through this normative turn. So firstly, just a quick sketch of this more cognitivist take on value. So cognitivism, as we know, is a representationalist framework, and it posits like the cognition is about problem solving, and that you have like a pre-given problem set. And this can be like articulated in the terms of functionalist and adaptionist conception. So value and normativity are, in this case, managed by some special cognitive functions, and these special cognitive functions have arisen from the process of natural selection. And so this special cognitive function, the role of value, is usually interpreted as some sort of appraisal of content. And the important thing to keep in mind is that this sort of appraisal is supposedly separable from some sort of gathering of information, assembling of content, planning and execution of action. And the next point is that norms are in a way inbuilt by natural selection. So you have, for instance, talk about the genome, which like specifies what is valuable and normal for survival that was like determined through evolution. And so the first shift, according to Barrett, is happens in the embodied mind, or like that's maybe actually not, but let's just stick to this simplified version, where you get this move from like this evolutionary survival to emphasizing persistence. So this is basically a move from a more evolutionary framework or adaptionist framework towards an organizational approach. And you get, so you move from like the organism simply being a pure product of like optimizing fitness to fitness in the sense of reproductive abundance, to a sort of mutual specification of organism and environment, and therefore like the persistence is posited in a way, and is some sort of implicit mother value of the organism itself. And importantly for this view, the value normativity are seen as intrinsic features of self-organized interactive dynamics, and experience, which is also a very important aspect of in the enactive framework, can be conceptualized as experience of value in terms of like systemic integrity. So maybe like a short example, for on the left we have like this more representationalist conception of a light sensing system, which regulates behavior according to some light threshold T, and we can like predefine, okay, if the light is above this level, or if it senses above this level T in some direction, it would move towards that light, so it would consider this positive, and if the light level is below some threshold, it would move away from darkness, so this would be like a going well, basically like a backing away of avoidance. And this sort of like what is good and what is bad is sort of arbitrary, that it's intrinsically defined, and positive and negative in this case are like almost functionally equivalent. Whereas comparing it to some sort of bacterial phototaxis, the system is dependent on light for its existence, as like, for instance, for its metabolism. So the value of light is related to this relative integrity of the system's identity. And why, like, the valuing as light as good is related to the integrity of the system, and, well, this backing away, or like bad, means sort of a deterioration to the integrity of the system, and it's determined from the system's point of view. So this is, I mean, you're all familiar with this by now. So there is, the first shift kind of emphasizes persistence, and it defines an implicit distinction between viable and non-viable. So systemic integrity and viability conditions are sort of conceptualized as self-grounding constraints of system behavior, but it's still the environment that enforces the constraints. So the possible trajectories are dead ends or natural drift in the embodied mind, and there's no directness of action from the organism. So there's no self-regulating in this sense, which would come from the organism, self-regulating according to some norm. So there is an implicit normative distinction between viable and non-viable from this sort of systemic integrity view of value arising from this distinct form of identity, but this distinction exists for the system only in the sense that it is brought forth by the system. There is no acting on the basis of this distinction. And so these are like the first, like a few dimensions that I'm like differentiated. So from this first shift, so norms can either be like pre-given, built-in, extrinsic, which could be like interpreted in this more adaptationist evolution framework, or like from a design framework, or norms can be self-created, self-grounded, intrinsic. Then there's the distinction between like what determines the possible trajectories of the behavior. Is it something that is enforced by the environment? So it's either leads to a dead end, or it's just random natural drift, or is the organism itself sort of enforcing the norms on itself? And then the distinction between explicit and implicit norms, this is a bit different from like the distinction from Timothy. So this is from more of a Barrett discrimination from explicit and implicit. So the explicit norm would be like discriminations that are possible from the perspective of the system. So, for instance, discriminating light level and stuff like that. Implicit norms would be like the general consequences of these discriminants that are not discernible by the system. So, like the fact that because it acts, it can like, because it follows light, that it has an explicit notion of survival. It doesn't in this case. So this is only like something that we as observers can say, okay, because the system can like differentiate light or like levels of light, it leads to its prolonged survival. Okay, so the second shift, this is going to be even more brief, is concerned with, or it emphasizes this sort of self-concern, and it's articulated in the article Life After Kant, and there's a strong influence of the philosopher Hans Jonas. We have mentioned him already at this conference. And the crucial move here is sort of associating autopoiesis is not just with the generation of an identity, but with a sort of positive normativity. So a self-concern, a striving, a need, a desire. And so this sort of normativity can be described more in some sort of prescriptive, positive terms, a sort of positive directed normativity in what we mean is behavioral orientation towards a state of affairs. So it could be articulated as a sort of yes to life, yes to persistence. And here we're like crossing some threshold and entering the world of subjectivity and intentionality, and the conceptualization of the system as some sort of an experienced subject for which its own integrity is affirmed as a value. So in this explicit role of like integrity as an explicit norm is, well, it's basically the cornerstone of the second shift. And so we can maybe add like a fourth distinction in dimensions, which would be like some sort of negative prescriptive normativity, which would be some sort of avoidance of or backing away, versus some sort of positive prescriptive normativity, which would conceptualize a sort of preference for, striving for what you should do. And so the third shift is like articulated like primarily in Di Paolo's paper on adaptivity, but also elaborated by Di Paolo, Barandiera, and Egbert, and others. And there, in this shift, you can see a greater appreciation for the asymmetrical relation of organism to environment. Notoriously, persistence is too all or nothing of a property to like be able to conceptualize some sort of regulation towards it. And so this is where like this definition of agency that I started with in the beginning comes from. So agents are autonomous systems that are sometimes capable of adaptively regulating their coupling with the environment according to norms established by their own viability condition. But here we have a sort of a backing away from this sort of more prescriptive normativity, prescriptive, so positive normativity of the Ionesian type, because this is only an implicit distinction between viable and non-viable states. The difference is that the system in this case is acting on the basis of this implicit distinction. So Barrett says that it's still a sort of like negative prescriptive normativity, normatively regulated behavior that only sort of backs away from proscribed states of conditions, not actively strives towards like some sort of integrity. And so we can conceptualize this or like articulate this in the sentence. It's like a no to the no of life, a sort of like a double negativity. Whether this is enough for like this sort of striving, we can maybe discuss later. And so the notion of adaptivity brings a sort of like the possibility of moving from a conceptualization of life as a process of self-production and self-maintenance to a sort of open-ended process of continual identity generation, but with its responses to partial breakdowns of the system's identity and its remaking of itself, in a way it also redefines system identity and its corresponding normativity. So it's, in the words of maybe Timothy, it's like a sort of a creative normativity, right? The normative frameworks shift through time as it like repairs, maybe when it encounters some difficulties, and when it repairs itself, it can, in certain cases, like remake itself so that its normative framework is sort of different. But then if we have this change, we have to ask, is this change itself something that is like normatively regulated? So moving from one sort of identity to the other, or is it something that happens just randomly? So for instance, you have like, you are infected by a virus or some sort of disease, your identity is partially broken down and you try to counteract it, and what you get at the end is not something that you were like, that was normatively regulated. It was just like randomly induced by the environment, and through the process of self-regulation that is like inherent in normativity, you came to have another sort of identity. So is this change, is this shift in normative frameworks something that is not regulated, or is it something that is in itself regulated by norms? And so this is like the last two dimensions that I'm going to mention. So either the norms sort of stay the same, or are a form of pre-given set of possible norms, which would be a sort of conservative normativity, or norms themselves, or normative frames themselves change, which would be a sort of creative normativity. And the last distinction would be, is this change from one normative framework to another itself regulated by norms, or is it completely random? And so this is trying to flesh out some of the dimensions of normativity through this to this normative turn, and then we can maybe conceptualize at the end what is missing in this, or what is going on now in the enactivist side moving forward. And so this is my part, and now Moritz, take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Lina, for agreement. How much time do we have left? So
a lot.
Okay, great. Thank you. Wow, so amazing in time. So
25 to 30 something.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So thank you very much for that nice introduction and contextualization of normativity and enactivism. So I actually, when I did my master's, I was a semester in Ljubljana, and I stumbled into Sebastian's class on Varela and Merleau-Ponty, and since then I'm a little bit infected with the enactivist virus. But my PhD project is on active inference, and especially on applications of active inference to subjective experience and to the self. So my theoretical background on enactivism is not as broad as Ela's, so it's very nice to start from this contextualization. So when we started talking, we kind of wanted to see what are the tensions when we discuss normativity in active inference and enactivism. And so wait, the first two are your outlines, right?
Yeah.
And mine are the red ones. Ah, yeah, okay. I was like, am I really going to talk about shifts in an activist conception? So I kind of pick up the point that Ela brought up by Paolo about the tumbling sheep and the rocks. What is the difference? And I was looking into the active inference literature, basically what Carl Friston and Maxwell Ramstead said about stones. What role do stones play in the free energy principle? So I will take up this example and try to analyze it from an active inference lens. I will give a little bit of a primer what active inference is. I mean, there are predictive processing, free energy principle. There are a lot of Bayesian brain. There are a lot of terms that are thrown around that are related but not the same. And then I will kind of make the argument that active inference goes, it assumes homeostasis of the organism, but it moves to this allostatic picture of cognitive control, where we try to predict bodily states and regulate them before they happen. And then I will go a little bit into the problems that I see with the active inference models, and the tensions that arise with enactivism in normativity, and also from a general philosophical assumption point of view, and present some bridges so that we can end on discussing how possible overlaps of the theories could help to clarify the concepts on both sides. Okay, so first I want to say that I'm not Carl Friston. I got this idea from Dalton Shakhtavidil, who always gives that in every talk. I'm not presenting the maximum version of the free energy principle that Carl usually defends. I'm kind of really looking at the pragmatic value of the free energy principle in cognitive modeling, and I want to see what the applications can do. So if you have any conceptual questions, please direct it to Carl himself. Okay, first of all, taking the rolling sheep as the starting point, keep that in mind. I will try to present some basics of active inference that help us to conceptualize what is the difference between the gradient descent in like nice Fristonian language of a stone down a hill and the sheep going down. Obviously, the hill is a perfect bell curve because this is always the assumption in the free energy principle. And I try to, in the next 20 minutes, ask the questions: what is the difference that agency have in active inference, the stone and the sheep? What is the difference in experience that they have? And what are the values that their behavior is governed by? Okay, so first of all, I will try to keep the mathematical details as little as possible. I want to talk a little bit about the idea because, I mean, it is from the ground up an idea to formalize cognition, and from then on they extended the scope of the free energy principle to biological self-organization and even to non-living systems. But the basic idea, active inference, is built on the free energy principle, which is a principle that cognitive systems need to minimize free energy, which is basically a lower bound for the surprising states of the environment and also the surprising bodily states. So if I, looking at my body temperature, for example, and it's like a couple of degrees above 37 or a couple below, then it's very surprising because this is not something that I would expect, and this is something that hinders my possibility to be in a homeostatic state. So basically, it's very surprising if you're in a state that will probably kill you. A rephrasing that I do, which we can argue if that's a good thing, but I think as a simplification and a first point of entrance, you can understand the free energy principle as a maximizing of predictability. Predictability of interoceptive, but also of exteroceptive states. So we basically, from the early beginnings as a theory of the brain, we now have Carl and Maxwell and others argue for the free energy principle as a general principle for self-organization. And I want to emphasize here that free energy is an analogy to thermodynamics, but it's only an analogy. It's, in its conception, an information process. So free energy is not something that you can directly measure in cognitive or living systems. It's an analogy that goes back to Helmholtz, but it's kind of like in a Shannon entropy sense, in that we should not take the concept to be very fundamental, but interpret it as like a modeling tool. That's kind of my take on it. So the important thing for predictability of an active inference agent is that we have a generative model. What is a generative model? So this is basically the mental model that an agent has, how the sensations that the agent gets are produced. So if I'm a couple of degrees over 37 in my body temperature, then a generative model would contain like all the possible causes for that. For example, I'm sitting in the hot sun in Ljubljana in the summer, or I'm in a sauna, stuff like that. The generative model contains our predictions of why our sensations are like they are. And active inference is kind of like an application of this generative model to real-life consequences of behavior. There have been a lot of interesting models in the last 2-3 years trying to apply active inference as like a process theory of the more general principle, which is the free energy principle, to the rubber hand illusion and like studying how our self-beliefs are generated. There is an interesting paper on conscious access where they try to make the first steps towards a minimal model of consciousness. And there's more pragmatic stuff like Lisa Feldman-Barrett's analysis of neuroanatomical data in the light of active inference. So it's basically, the free energy principle in itself is not a model, it's not testable. It's a general principle, like Hamilton's principle of least action, for example. And why am I looking at active inference? because that's where the models are that are actually experimentally tractable. And this is also the kind of application to like, what is the experience of the sheep? The free energy principle on its own will not give you an explanation to that. But if you add some extra assumptions, you can model the sheep as an active inference agent that implicitly follows the free energy principle. Okay, so why active inference? Basically, we only talked about like the generative model as updating our beliefs. So we try to like predict the environment, but we not only predict the environment by like changing our beliefs of what the environment is like, but we can also act on the environment. So we basically sample the states in a way that make them fit our expectations. So this is like a more general idea of thermodynamics of value that has been argued in a lot of different ways. For example, Prigogine, as we will talk about, where we take as a starting point usually Schrödinger's question of how can organisms locally violate the second law of thermodynamics, how can they decrease entropy locally, and this has been argued in a lot of like, dynamical systems ways already, and this is like a train of thought that the active inference people take up, and in a recent paper they argued that free energy considers living systems as adaptive self-organizing patterns. But this is not a definition, so there is no mark of living systems derived from the free energy principle. They kind of like take this like very broad continuum approach. And this is like where one of the tensions with enactivism comes from, that like the enactivists are looking for a bright red line between living and non-living systems, and the free energy principle doesn't give you that. It's more like, okay, it just gets more complex, and then we have adaptivity, autonomy, and self-organization. So Ramstead in a 2018 paper says, from the point of view of a physicist, the price corresponds to thermodynamic potential energy, such that minimizing variational free energy entails the minimization of thermodynamic entropy. So they really tried to take the physicist's point of view here, and they overstretched this analogy to thermodynamics a bit, since like this framing as thermodynamic entropy kind of like makes you believe you can measure it directly in the system, which is still under discussion how we should do that. Something that I found very similar in the framing that like they use, and they also quote Prigogine, so maybe they just got all these ideas from him, that I like about, is his quote from Order Out of Chaos: "We grow in direct proportion to the amount of chaos we can sustain and dissipate." So perturbations here are not kind of like, perturbation, the name is kind of a negative framing of like, okay, we have some dynamics, and these dynamics are going on, but there is perturbation that could like destroy these dynamics. But like the free energy principle and also like dynamic coupling and like in activist terms, they kind of make the statement that without any external influence, there would be no internal dynamics. So they are co-constituted. And this is something that I've seen in Prigogine, nicely formulated. Okay, so why is that interesting? Why is active inference take on cognitive and biological norms relevant? It's just a motivation of like a rethinking of the usual assumptions we have behind living agents. So one of them is that living agents are homeostatic agents, so they control the bodily states to set points, sorry for that typo, that enable living dynamics. And the free energy principle basically builds on this like Helmholtzian idea of unconscious inference that can be understood as a process of allostasis. So it's not only enough to like, when your bodily states change in a dangerous way, that you move away, so you react to the environmental influence, but you actively need to predict what's going on and therefore not even get yourself in a dangerous situation in the first place. So allostasis can be understood as the predictive regulation of resources that coordinate to coordinate bodily states. There has been a lot of discussion about like what these state space models with like where you have fixed bodily states that change over time, how you can use them. And something that in the recent discussion on active inference has come up, that maybe there are no set points, but there are certain processes, living processes, that need to be sustained. This is especially interesting when we look at subjective experience. And I think they're making steps towards understanding life as a process and not just look for characteristic states. And this can be understood as homeostasis, where the regulation is towards stable flows and not stable states. And I would like to bring these two together. I haven't seen it in the literature yet. Please, if you know that, I want to see how allostasis and homeostasis work together, if someone has published about that. I would call it allorasis because I'm like very, very lazy, but it would be a fitting name that we like predictively regulate flows of experience, flows of bodily function. And this kind of like allostatic lens has already led to a lot of interesting models. A recent one is like organizing the neuroanatomy in a way that is in line with the free energy principle. And that's like work by Lisa Feldman-Barrett together with a student Katsumi, where they use allostasis to find allostatic gradients in the brain. And they claim this is like a general organization principle of the human cortex. I'm not going to go into that too much. How much time do I have left? Can I go into it or not? Okay, I can't go into that. If you're interested, we can discuss it later, or you can just check out the paper. It's a very nice idea to like actually put down like the assumptions and actually relate it to brain structure, which would make it testable in the end. Are you doing? Okay, yeah, you took a picture, great. So, what is the argument about the experience of the difference between sheep and stones? According to this continuum argument, I just like polarizingly said sheep are just fluffy stones. The free energy principle doesn't give you like a qualitative difference. It's more quantitative difference of like there's more complexity. Certain regulatory loops are more important than in stones. Why is that? So you can look at a rock in a stream and model it with the free energy principle, no problem. You can look how the shape of the rock changes over time because it's continuously hit by the waves. And in the free energy principle language, it can be understood as adaptation over long time scales. Is that the kind of biological adaptivity that we're looking for? Obviously it's not. But the free energy principle will not give you this qualitative explanation, what the difference is. And what it can give you is the way that like the complexity changes when sheep roll down a hill and they actually try to make a plan on how to lift up their feet to get firm ground again. And this is done by action perception loops and autonomous states. So on the right, you see a nice conceptualization of like the mathematical formalization, where in the active inference models, you usually make a distinction between like the external and the internal states. Nothing new there, but the important thing is they are sparsely coupled through the so-called blanket states. What are the blanket states? It's basically the sensory states, the information that we assume comes in, and the active states, how the organism can change external states. But the important thing here is it's not like the classic sandwich model of like linear information processing where you have some sensation and information coming in, the cognitive system making the processing and then outputting some action, but sensory and active states are coupled as well. And basically active inference makes the assumption that these action perceptions are loops. They have a circular causality that cannot be modeled by linear processes. So we can model stones as if they minimize free energy. The question is, what do we gain from it? They don't have any obvious sensation. They don't have the possibility to select actions. And we basically end up with a very complicated formalism for something that like physicists have done a long time ago, much simpler. So the active inference picture only becomes interesting when we include these autonomous states which, like you can see at the top, are subsumed as alpha, where you have like the active states and the internal states, which are statistically independent from the external states. I'm not going to talk about the Helmholtz decomposition because I'm already too late. So now we come to the interesting discussion that we had when we prepared this talk, that we wanted to look what is the advantage or what is the drawbacks of like the active inference models with enactivism. As Ela already pointed out, the active inference people have made some effort to connect to the enactivist community, and the enactivist community has pushed back a little bit. I mean, we discussed this also the other day. I mean, it's not as clear like how strong the divide really is, but in a highly debated paper from 2022, Paolo, Thompson, and Bear argued that they are different in some very fundamental ways. One of them is the understanding of embodied dynamics and this kind of like opposition to the computational perspective and the use of information theory. A second one is the historicity that the active inference, they say the active inference framework doesn't take into account the path dependence of living dynamics. So basically it doesn't matter how they got to a certain state, they only can model what happens from there. And another big divide that they see is that operational closure for them is about organization, and the kind of equivalent in active inference literature, the Markov blankets, the blanket states that I talk about of sensation and action, they are structure. So for me, the biggest problem that I see is this kind of, if you want to explain subjective experience and the emergence of norms, then in activism you have this asymmetry of normativity. So you cannot like ascribe the same norms to the internal or to the external states. And in active inference, the mathematical apparatus is completely symmetrical. So it doesn't matter if you change the labels of internal and external. You can say the system models the environment, but mathematically it's completely equivalent in the free energy principle to say the environment models the system. So if we want to explain subjective experience, where the point of view of the observer comes from, then we need something more. So what are the bridges that we have over these divides? So as discussed, there is like this argument by the enactivists that computationalism and information theory is something that is not in line with enactivist thought, basically assumes that prediction models, that they are all representations of some external features. So there is a non-representationalist perspective. For example, Maxwell Ramstead really puts forward that the generative model is not about representing the world, but it's about an action-oriented coupling. It's about survival and interaction, and it's not about representing what's out there. I talked about the sandwich model a little bit. Action perception loops and circular causality is something that goes beyond this classic cognitivist picture. And I would assume that like taking a Jaynesian perspective is something that would bring them a bit closer by interpreting the probabilities as inferences themselves and kind of like epistemic practice, and not taking probabilities as, in the frequentist sense, as part of the world. The mind-life continuity is obviously very analogous to this more like continuum argument. The problem is that enactivism would need a mark of biological dynamics, and the free energy principle cannot provide it. Yet, maybe. There's a nice discussion with Kate Nath at the moment, who wrote a whole book about saying that the free energy principle doesn't give you any idea of what life is, and this like started a nice discussion. Maybe this will lead to like a refinement where we can talk about the qualitative differences as well. A recent move of the active inference literature is also like taking phenomenal experience and phenomenal consciousness seriously, this would like imply this kind of symmetry breaking that I was talking about before, and they're trying to tackle that recently. Okay, so let's finish up with discussing our dimensions of normativity that Ela brought up before. So it's pretty clear that like in the current formulation we have this kind of stable norms regulate to specific set points, but we would need to have a shift to dynamic norms in the sense of homeostasis, stable flows. The thing that the free energy principle says about the distinction between proscriptive and prescriptive norms is, since it's symmetrical, it doesn't matter if you minimize free energy or if you maximize predictability. Mathematically, it's the same. And in the idea, like in the discussion, if they're explicit or implicit norms, you could say that the representational interpretation has explicit norms, but since they're not measurable in experiment, I would much rather argue that the norms, we as scientists impose the norms on the system by the models, by the computational tools that we use. So you could say it's implicit, you could say it's practice. And the last question that we discussed, I haven't figured out that at all, is the question if how active inference systems change their norms, if the change is regulated, if it's supervised or if it's unsupervised. And I looked at a lot of literature, I didn't find any discussion of that, so this would maybe be an interesting point for further debate. Okay, do you want to give the concluding remarks? I think I summed up.
I mean, these are like just some, it's very some like open-ended remarks, because it's actually really hard to compare these two frameworks. Maybe we just like set some grounds to maybe think about it a bit more later. I think that active inference still remains within this sort of conservative normativity, and this also leads back to the argument by Paolo that it has no sense of historicity, and Moritz talked about this no path dependence that is like, I think, very important in conceptualization of life, especially in enactivism. Regarding the question mark of what is happening in enactivism, for me, it would be interesting to try to conceptualize how do we get from something being an implicit norm to actually having some sort of explicit norm to which you are then regulating your behavior, and also how to get from this only sort of backing away from instabilities to maybe striving for some sort of valuable state. Also, the question of what regulates the regulators should be. So, can this sort of creative normativity itself be normatively regulated? And maybe some questions are, at least from what I read in enactivist literature, could be assigned from like this sort of partial decoupling that happens in autonomous identities. So Barandiaran writes about this, and Varela obviously writes about this also, so that you have like several identities actually present in the system itself. So then you can maybe, if these identities are partially decoupled, then you can imagine like one regulating the other and so on. And maybe also the work on participatory sense making, where you have like autonomy at the level of the interaction, which can then also serve as a sort of normative framework that regulates lower levels of normativity. And I mean, we mentioned this, so I think we can finish this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this great talk. So, I'm interested in many things. In particular, I'm interested in this issue of whether the change in the norms governing the functioning of an individual system, whether this change itself is framed by some norms. this is something I'm really interested in, and this also refers to your last remark about participatory sense-making. So my question, I believe, is, would you regard this question as a kind of, and you can take it as an intro reminder, as a kind of bridge to some kind of account or discourse on collectives and collective action or collective agency and how these norms are collectively established. So this is, I believe, the question. And just a quick remark, it's a surprising coincidence that when it comes to, it's not a question, just a remark, when it comes to predictive processing, I'm right now reviewing the work of one guy who argues in a couple of papers, very well published, that predictive processing is essentially representationalist, and they apply structural representation. So these models, predictive models, are actually structural representation. So this is quite surprising how many things you can take from this one approach. But this is just a nice coincidence. So yeah, I believe.
Maybe I would actually first respond to the remark. There's this paper by Ramstead. What's it called? A tale of two densities. They're very poetic, and they explicitly there they contrast like this interpretation of predictive processing or like active inference under free energy principle as a structural representation of this account, and then they try to argument why it should be interpreted in more like an activist sense. But I don't think it's maybe check that out. As far as the climbing the ladder of normativity goes, I think all of these approaches that start from the bottom, so to say, and like try to build up into some sort of full-blown social normativities are probably going to have some issues. Maybe it's more in the line with also what Timothy said yesterday, that we try to conceptualize how like the agents themselves are plastic enough so as to participate in some sort of like dynamics then later on some higher level. But this is part of what I want to read upon, so this participatory sense making and also linguistic bodies, I have to read that because they then also start talking about abstractions and stuff like that. But this is something further reading for in the future for me.
And just to add to the predictive processing debate, I mean, this is kind of like a debate that has been there from the beginning of predictive processing, because like Jacob Holloway, like he takes it very realist, very representationalist, and Annie Clark always like he called it moderate predictive processing. By now there's kind of like so many different interpretations that like my PhD project started out as I wanted to clarify philosophical issues of the free energy principle. I completely gave up on that after a couple of months because there's so many diverging positions there, and so I was focusing on specific models, and I don't like Maxwell Ramstead's perspective is the one that is closer to enactivism in a certain sense, but there are some that are like completely diverging.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much for this wonderful talk. And I'm so happy that I'm learning so many things here. It's really great. And you know, you really managed to give me a sort of glimpse of what active inference could be. Because I tried to understand it before, and before coming here I was thinking I can't go here without knowing what it is. And then I started to research and didn't get it. So you see, that was the state of mind I was in when I came here. So thank you for this. And also for the whole wrapping up of the story. It's very interesting to see this three-step thing where I'm sort of part in this second station, which is, you know, it's a little bit out of there are two lines actually. So the first and third are on the same level, and then the second is kind of like a little jump somewhere, and then you're getting back in line. And I mean, I'm as the kind of guy guilty for bringing Jonas into this thing, bringing Jonas to Paris. I want to reiterate my mantra, which you already know, that the whole point about Jonas was to take serious the irreducible, lived, experienced, existential perspective. So that is you talked a little bit about this. You said, okay, then it becomes somewhat intentional, and you have you somehow grasp it. But it is not conceptual. It is first person, and it is weird a little bit because you introduce something which you can only understand if you do live it in that moment when you understand it into a sort of theoretical argument. But that is what the whole argument is about. And when Jonas uses this term Urwert aller Werten, which then is translated as mother value of all values, this is an experiential dimension. It is not a norm. It is not a value in terms of which you can abstract. It is something which you need to know because you know it actually. He knows it when he writes about it. So that's I repeat this to somehow show that actually, to my understanding, this has been lost again. I experienced the discussion as this has been lost again, so I find it very instructive that our paper is somehow like a little error. There's one level of error, and then there's this strange paper, and then you're somehow getting back to abstraction. And I think it's wrong. I think this needs to be somehow taken into account, and however this is done in theory, or maybe theory can't remain theory, it needs to be taken into account, because then if you don't do it, you omit that which you're actually talking about, or which you're actually vividly concerned about. And that was the whole point of someone writing this article. He said there's something irreducible, and it needs to be taken into account. And in a way, so that's sort of my observation. But then the whole story you're retelling from Paolo, the poor sheep story, actually, the way we treated this is actually just illustrating what I'm talking about. Because when I read this, or you read it to me, it made me feel terrified. It's terrible. If I saw this sheep falling down this rock, it would be just horrible. Like, oh my God. And I mean, the sheep doesn't do any calculations. The sheep just feels terror. That is what is happening. It doesn't somehow compute how to put the feet, whatever. It feels terror. And we cannot omit this. And even in telling this story like this, it's kind of like, okay, let's look at what is going on structurally. But what is going on, and what we can immediately understand, is that there is something absolutely terrible happening to someone who is about to realize their own fecundity. And if we take it out, then we do what science does. We take this out, and it's wrong. Because this is what the world is about also, or maybe in its center. And then when you put this slide on, sheep are fluffy stones, I wasn't sure, was it joking, tongue in cheek or whatever, or was it just, then we're back again at this thing, and you say, okay, actually sheep are fluffy stones. If we really conceptual formalize the shit out of it, to quote Yogi, then sheep are fluffy stones, okay, but they're not. I mean, I would really go with you into the other direction and say stones are hard-shelled sheep, and I would like this much more, And so going into the panpsychist thing, I would sustain this much more. But we can't do this. We can't do this anymore. Like not in 2024, with the situation of life on Earth, we cannot do this. So I'm doing an emphatic pledge for the Jonasian thing. This is something which needs to go into how we are concerned with the living reality. This needs to be there, otherwise we will miss the point. But it's a beautiful presentation that motivated me to get that.
Part of the point of Barrett is just that there's like a tension in like modern activists, precisely because in a way they took they still talk about this striving and striving for your integrity, and they put so much value on experience playing a sort of explanatory role also in their account. But on the other hand, they, like these models of adaptivity, adaptive autonomous behavior is precisely, it stays in the realm of proscriptive normativity. And I'm not saying this, like, I didn't put the graph from your, from the Bible, from your following in the norm. You have it, okay, but there you have like this graph, and you have a normative field that is conceptualized in the precarious region. So then the ship would fall into this model. So basically, feeling terror would be explained by this sort of model. If you go into if you're in a precarious state, you feel some sort of tension, you feel some sort of terror, pain, and you want to come back to a sort of a viable state. But in that same graph, the normative field in the viable region is non-existent. They're just dots, right? So in a sense, you don't have any sort of positive striving in the viable region itself. So that's the distinction that I think Barrett tries to make, that we need to try to, if we want to take like some sort of experience of like a positive striving towards something seriously, we have to like have some sort of normativity also in this sort of viable region. Sorry.
Can I respond?
Yes.
Or maybe I have an hour to respond. Please respond.
Yeah,
No, because I have an hour now to respond. This is abusive. Come on, any other question?
No, and actually we will have to wrap it up.
Okay, I just say one little remark two short remarks. First, the Fluffy Stones picture is intentionally cartoonish to like show how cartoonish the models are that are claimed to represent the things. And the second thing is that like what Anil Seth calls the real problem of consciousness, as like how can we find correlations between experiential dimensions and the cognitive models that we have. This is kind of like what I'm interested in, what active inference, if active inference can do any of this correlation of things. But I also like to Friesen and Maxwell also argued that like they need to capture something, otherwise it's completely useless, as we decided to talk about lived experience.
Thank you.
Okay, another round of applause for